Frank lived alone in a modest suburban house, the kind of place where every creak in the floorboards seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. He cherished his solitude, finding comfort in the predictability of his quiet life. However, one evening, his peace was shattered in a way he could never have anticipated. It started with a phone call just after sunset. Frank answered, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. Instead, he heard frantic breathing. Before he could speak, a young girl's voice, barely a whisper, said, "Please, help me." "Who is this?" Frank asked, his heart pounding. "Emily." "He's after me," the girl replied. The line went dead before Frank could ask anything else. Disturbed, Frank glanced out his window, scanning the street. It was eerily quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows. He tried to shake off the unease, convincing himself it was a prank. But the worry gnawed at him. An hour later, there was a knock at his door. Frank hesitated, then opened it to find a girl no older than 12, her face pale and streaked with tears. It was Emily. She looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to emerge from the darkness. "Can I come in, please?" she pleaded. Frank stepped aside, letting her in. "What's going on? Who's after you?" Emily glanced around nervously. "A man. He's been following me for days. I don't know what he wants." Frank's protective instincts kicked in. "You're safe here. Let's call the police." As he reached for his phone, Emily grabbed his arm. "No," he said, "if I call the police, he'll hurt my family." Frank's mind raced. "All right, let's stay calm. We'll figure this out." They locked all the doors and windows, drawing the curtains. Frank tried to comfort Emily, but his own fear was hard to conceal. He watched the clock, each minute feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Emily gasped, clutching Frank's arm. "He's here," she whispered. Frank's pulse quickened. He grabbed a flashlight and led Emily to a small closet in the back of the house. "Stay here. Don't make a sound," he instructed. He moved cautiously through the house, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. In the living room, he heard a faint noise, a window being pried open. Frank's blood ran cold. He needed to act fast. Grabbing a heavy metal candlestick, Frank crept toward the sound. His heart pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay quiet. As he reached the window, he saw a figure dressed in black halfway through the opening. With all his strength, Frank swung the candlestick. It connected with a sickening thud, and the intruder slumped, half in and half out of the window. Frank's hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone, finally dialing 911. The police arrived quickly, apprehending the unconscious man. Emily's story, corroborated by Frank's testimony and the evidence of forced entry, made it clear she had been in grave danger. As the officers took the man away, one of them turned to Frank. "You did a brave thing tonight. You saved her life." Frank nodded, still shaken. Emily looked up at him, gratitude and relief in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. For the first time in years, Frank felt the comforting weight of another person's trust. As he watched the taillights of the police car fade into the night, he knew his life had changed. The quiet would return, but it would never be the same. The shadows now held memories of a night when fear had invaded his home and the bravery it took to drive it away. In the days that followed, Frank couldn't shake the events of that night. He replayed every moment in his mind, questioning his actions and what might have happened if he had done something differently. Emily stayed with him temporarily while her family made arrangements for her safety. They grew closer, an unlikely pair bound by the trauma they shared. Emily's parents were deeply grateful to Frank. They expressed their gratitude in person, their voices choked with emotion. "We can never repay you for what you did," her mother said, tears in her eyes. Frank simply nodded. "I'm just glad she's safe." Emily's presence brought a new energy to Frank's home. She was a resilient girl, slowly regaining her confidence. Frank found himself protective of her, a stark contrast to his previously solitary life. They would spend evenings talking, and she shared stories about her school, friends, and dreams for the future. Frank, in turn, shared stories from his own life, finding a comfort in opening up he hadn't known he needed. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily spoke up. "I don't know how to thank you. Frank, you saved me." Frank looked at her, the weight of the past days evident in his eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Emily. Just promise me you'll be careful and always speak up if you feel unsafe. You have people who care about you." Emily nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I will. And I'll always remember what you did for me." Eventually, Emily returned to her family, but she and Frank kept in touch. She would visit often, bringing a sense of joy and youth to Frank's home. Their bond, forged in fear and danger, became a source of strength and comfort for both. Life settled back into a routine for Frank, but he was no longer the same. The quiet of his house felt different now, not as lonely. He had faced a terrifying ordeal and emerged stronger, with a new sense of purpose and connection. One night, months later, Frank received a letter from Emily. It was a simple note, but it meant the world to him. "Dear Frank, I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to let you know that I'm doing great. I'm back at school, and things are normal again. But I haven't forgotten what you did for me. I think about you often and the bravery you showed that night. You're my hero, and I'm so grateful to have you in my life. Thank you, always. Emily." Frank read the letter several times, a smile spreading across his face. The shadows that had once seemed so menacing now felt less daunting. He had faced his fears and come out the other side, not alone, but with a new sense of family and connection. Sam had never minded being home alone. At 17, he was used to his parents' frequent business trips. The house was large, but he'd grown accustomed to the silence and the creaks that echoed through the halls at night. It was a Friday evening in late November, and his parents were out of town again. Sam settled into the living room, wrapped in a blanket, ready for a quiet night of movies and snacks. As he scrolled through the channels, his phone buzzed with a text from his mom. "Don't forget to lock the doors and set the alarm. Be safe." Sam rolled his eyes but obliged, getting up to check the locks and arm the security system. He returned to the couch, reassured by the soft beep confirming the house was secured. An hour later, halfway through a horror movie, Sam heard a faint noise. He paused the movie, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to be coming from the back door. Sam's heart rate quickened, but he reminded himself it was probably just a branch hitting the window. He tried to ignore it and resumed his movie. But the tapping continued, growing more insistent. Sam's unease intensified. He muted the TV and crept to the kitchen, where he could see the back door from the hallway. The kitchen was dark, and the only light came from the living room, casting long, eerie shadows. As he approached, he saw the door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine. He distinctly remembered locking it. Sam stepped closer, his breath hitching. He reached out and slowly pushed the door closed, engaging the lock with a decisive click. Just as he turned away, he heard it again. A soft, deliberate knock. But this time, it came from the other side of the door. Sam's blood ran cold. He backed away, glancing around for something to defend himself with. The kitchen was full of potential weapons, but his mind raced, making it hard to decide. He grabbed a large chef's knife, the metal cool and reassuring in his hand. His phone buzzed again. Startled, he looked at the screen. Another text from his mom. "Did you hear that noise? Everything okay?" Sam's heart pounded in his chest. His mom couldn't have known about the noise. He was alone, or so he thought. He looked around the kitchen, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist in the dim light. He decided to call the police. He picked up his phone, but just as he dialed, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness. Panic surged through him. He fumbled with his phone, using the flashlight to navigate. The kitchen knife felt heavy in his grip. A creak echoed from upstairs, followed by another. Someone was inside the house. Sam's breath came in shallow gasps. He moved silently, trying to avoid making any noise. He needed to get to the front door, but it felt impossibly far away. Every creak of the floorboards under his feet seemed deafening. He reached the living room, heart pounding, when he heard another noise, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It sounded like his name. Sam. The voice was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from the stairs. Sam's mind raced. He needed to hide. He slipped into the small closet under the stairs, closing the door as quietly as possible. In the darkness, he tried to steady his breathing, clutching the knife tightly. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The house was deathly silent now. Just as Sam started to believe he might be safe, the closet door creaked open, and a beam of light pierced the darkness. He held his breath, muscles tense, ready to strike. The light moved, scanning the closet. Then the door was flung open, and Sam's heart stopped. "Sam, it's me." His father stood there, flashlight in hand, looking as frightened as Sam felt. "I got home early and heard noises. Are you okay?" Sam let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, dropping the knife. Relief washed over him, but as they left the closet, his father's expression changed, his eyes widening in horror as he looked past Sam. "Who else is here?" his father whispered, his voice trembling. Sam turned slowly, following his father's gaze, and saw the back door standing wide open. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he followed his father's gaze. The back door, which he had locked just moments ago, was wide open, swinging slightly in the cold night breeze. His father tightened his grip on the flashlight, his face pale. "Stay behind me," his father whispered, moving cautiously toward the open door. Sam grabbed the kitchen knife again, his hands trembling. The house, once a haven, now felt like a labyrinth of lurking threats. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of his vision as he followed his father. They reached the door, and Sam's father peered into the darkness outside. "I'll check the perimeter," he said, his voice barely audible. "Lock the door behind me and call the police." Sam nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He watched his father disappear into the night, then quickly closed and locked the door, his fingers fumbling with the latch. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. 911, what's your emergency?" "Someone's in my house," Sam whispered urgently. "My dad is outside checking. Please send someone quickly." The operator assured him that help was on the way and stayed on the line with him. Sam moved to the living room, his eyes darting around, every noise amplified in the silence. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Minutes passed, feeling like an eternity, when he heard the sound of sirens approaching. Relief washed over him. He ran to the front door, unlocking it just as the police arrived. 2 officers entered, their presence reassuring. "Are you Sam?" one of the officers asked. Sam nodded, trying to explain the situation through his panic. The officers split up, one searching the house while the other stayed with Sam. They heard a commotion outside, and Sam's father reappeared, escorted by the second officer. "I didn't find anyone outside," his father said, his voice shaky but relieved. "Is everyone okay?" The officers completed their search of the house and found no intruder. They concluded that whoever had been there was gone now, likely scared off by Sam's father and the approaching sirens. They advised securing all the locks and suggested that Sam and his father stay somewhere else for the night, just to be safe. After the police left, Sam and his father packed a few things and drove to a nearby hotel. The sense of unease lingered, but at least they were safe. As they settled into their hotel room, Sam's father turned to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Sam," he said softly. "We're safe now. Try to get some rest." Sam nodded, but sleep felt impossible. The events of the night played over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had been watched, that someone had been inside the house with him. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, they returned home. The house was just as they had left it, the sense of intrusion now a haunting memory. They spent the day repairing the locks and adding extra security measures, determined not to let fear take over their home. As night fell, Sam found himself in the living room again, the same blanket wrapped around him. The house was quiet, but the silence was different now, heavier. His phone buzzed with a text from his mom. "How's everything?" Sam hesitated before replying. "We're okay. Just a scare." He looked around the living room, the familiar surroundings now tinged with a lingering dread, but he was determined not to let it control him. He settled back onto the couch, ready to face whatever came next.